on, everybody? It's your boy Luke, here with a little course breakdown action, this time for the Rocket Mortgage Classic. I'll be bringing you everything you need to know for this week about Detroit Golf Club, and how I expect the course to play, of course some of the fantasy implications of the conditions we expect this year, as well as from the betting perspective, or just from a fan perspective, what to expect from the PGA Tour venue here. We'll talk about some of my key stats for analysis, what I'm using to try and identify some of the top projected plays this week, as well as some of the other courses around the PGA Tour that I'm using as a comparison for that same type of analysis. So by the end, whether you're experienced here in the golf DFS sphere, betting sphere, whatever your sphere may be, or brand new to it, hopefully by the end, you'll have a better idea of what to expect this week. So excited to hop into it. Let's go ahead and get this thing rocking. Alrighty, so we've got ourselves Detroit Golf Club this week, a Donald Ross design, which might not be all that familiar to a lot of you out there. There's only a few golf courses on the PGA Tour schedule where we actually get to see what Mr. Ross has to offer, but historically, one of the more prominent course architects, particularly down in Florida or my area, where I've played on just more than a few dozen Donald Ross designs, most particularly one that's about a mile away from my house. So I get out there, 20, 30 rounds every few months. And then down in South Miami, where we have the Biltmore, which my brother goes to the University of Miami. So I get down there for plenty of rounds as well. And with a Donald Ross design, there are a few key characteristics that come to mind. First off are the green styles. You have these turtle shell type greens where all the undulation is running from back to front. And then on the sides, you have plenty of side slope where if you're just hardly hitting the surface, and this week you don't have the largest greens, that's for sure. Obviously with the more antiquated game that all these designs were made for, obviously early designs in the 1900s, they really weren't designed for this quote-unquote modern game. So a lot of those side slopes really came into play, more of like a link style type setup where you had to almost play the ball along the ground. And that was because you had, like 3-irons or woods into a lot of the greens rather than literal pitching wedges like you're going to see all around the track this week. So the golf course, while, for an amateur, you're going to get some of that link style setup. For these professionals, it's target practice. It's a golf course that is severely outdated, and Detroit Golf Club, though it's had a few renovations to try and combat the modern game, it has really failed at that objective. You can see a winning score here, well near 20 under par. You saw 18 under par win it last year, and arguably that was one of the harder years with the setup. Bryson and Matthew Wolff were able to absolutely annihilate this place, and even when Nate Lashley won and the winning score wasn't nearly as good, you still had a weaker field. There wasn't all of the big names there, and I think that's why you saw the winning score there a little bit lower. So this golf course, I at least think it's a little bit antiquated for the modern power approach that we see here on the PGA Tour, but nonetheless, you still see a lot of those Donald Ross key characteristics, especially on the greens here. And let's talk about some of the setup. So it's a par 72 up here at Detroit Golf Club, and it's your typical par 72. So 4 par 3s, 4 par 5s on the docket, and one of the par 5s is over 620 yards. So despite this being designed in the early 1900s, like I said, a few renovations over the years have added some length, and because of its location in Detroit, there was really only so much they could do, only so much land that they could actually add to the property. So some holes, like the 600-yard par 5, are certainly not reachable by the entire field, but you're going to have par 5s that are closer to 540 yards, and most notably, plenty of par 4s less than 400 yards. So though you have that one super long par 5, you're going to see an insane amount of wedges this week from that 75 to 100 yard range, that 100 to 125 yard range. So that's what I mean when I call this place target practice, because on top of that, you have extremely generous areas off the tee. So while it might not be the longest golf course, you certainly have a lot of width to work with around Detroit Golf Club. Because it was designed in the early 1900s, they weren't really worrying about the rough. I mean, the game was a lot more from fairway in than it was from tee into the green. Today, obviously, it's a full test from the whole way from the tee box into the greens, but really the focus in the early 1900s, really the golden era of golf, was all about the greens, or all about your shots into those greens as well. And you can see that at a Donald Ross design. One thing that a lot of the renovations at this course have done over the years is add sufficient fairway bunkering. And you'll see that when we go hole by hole. A lot of the fairway bunkering is placed at strategic locations, and a lot of them have been added over the last 10 to 15 years. When Donald Ross goes out and designs golf courses, didn't really use a lot of bunkers back in the day. It's really something that's been added to a lot of his golf courses over the years, particularly the ones that I played down here in Florida. They have a lot more bunkers than what they had when they were first in inception, but the ones up here in Detroit Golf Club are particularly well placed. For players that are hitting it about 280 to 200 and maybe even 95 yards off the tee, they're going to come and play on almost every single par 4. So despite this being a quote-unquote birdie fest, plenty of wedges in hand, you still have to be executing shots both off the tee and of course into the greens, which I've already mentioned aren't all that large. So let's go ahead and start with the scoring average. So actually, we'll start with the yardage. It is 7,370 yards, and last year played to an average of 70.55. So for a par 72, right around 1.45 shots under par, which is a whole stroke easier than tour average. So, usually you're seeing right around 0.4 shots being your average tour event. This played a whole stroke and a half under par, and despite that, despite being a quote-unquote birdie fest, you don't get like a 25 to 30 under par winner. So you're going to see plenty of solid scoring out there, 4 to 5 under rounds, but you're not going to see a bunch of like 9 to 11 under par rounds. So you're going to get plenty of birdie opportunities, but there's still going to be a few holes out there, like the 600-yard par 5, which there are birdies to be had there, but to execute 3 straight shots in a row, that can be a problem from players from time to time. So there are a few holes with a little bit of teeth out there, but every single hole around Detroit Golf Club is more than birdieable for every single player in the field. It doesn't matter if you're a bomber, somebody that's more of a plotter. There are more than one avenues to success around this track. Let's go ahead and look into some of the more key characteristics of this golf course. So first off, penalty shots. You're hardly going to see them around this track. There's only one water hazard. It is on a par 5 where you have a small retention lake right in front of the green there in the par 5. But outside of that, no hazards to be had. There is one out of bounds and play off the tee, but other than that, nothing to be had there. So last year, the lowest amount of penalty strokes of any course on tour, where there were just 0.08 penalty strokes per round for the field. So 8/100ths of a stroke per round. So over 4 rounds, right around a third of a stroke for every single player out there, which oftentimes was an out of bounds, so counting 2 strokes at a time. Not many players got into trouble. The greens, like I said, are relatively small. They are just 5,150 square foot per green, and that is on average. But last year, we're hit at an extremely high rate. When it came to GIR, it was hit at a 75% rate, which is a whole 6.8% higher than tour average. So small targets, but they were hit in bunches. We'll talk about why here in a second. Next up, we've got the fairways, which in 2021 were hit at a 72.2% rate, which was also 6.3% more than tour average. And that was despite only being 37 yards wide, which was only 2.3 yards wider than tour average. They are a bent POA mix, much like the greens here, which are a hybrid surface. So similar to what we had at TPC River Highlands, where it's going to be right around a 75-25 split between bent grass and then POA Anua, which makes them run extremely pure. We saw that for a lot of the spring season down there in Florida. Some of the golf courses in Texas also had a bent POA mix. So this is something that we have plenty of data on here in the 2021-2022 season. So don't be alarmed by that. I know a few people around the industry kind of get a little bit flustered or a little bit fluxed when it comes to this sort of stuff, but we've seen it enough times this year to actually draw from a large enough sample size. So that's what I'll be doing in that department. And the rough here is a 4-inch bluegrass mix. So also similar to what we've seen for a lot of the Northeastern golf tournaments. You think the Wells Fargo Championship, you saw it up there. The Travelers also had a bluegrass mix, and generally kind of plays like a Bermuda grass mix. I mean, anytime you have bluegrass or Bermuda and it gets over that 3-inch mark, it is going to play a huge factor on the weekend. But let's talk about why this golf course played so easy. Last year, it was extremely receptive. There was plenty of rain the week and a half before the golf tournament, and as a result, both the fairways and the greens were extremely damp, extremely receptive, and players were able to throw darts. This year, it could not be more different. From everything I've seen on property, from the weather reports over the last few weeks, it's been extremely dry, and really, newsflash, right? If you've watched the news over the last few weeks, that's all they've been talking about, right? Is how hot it is pretty much everywhere around the United States. So don't be surprised to see perhaps slightly harder conditions this year. So with the greens not being nearly as receptive, you might see a lower GIR percentage. And on top of that, the fairways a little bit crustier, also a little bit firmer and faster. It's going to make them a little bit harder to hit, particularly if you're a bomber and you're putting a lot of spin on the golf ball. So while in the past we've had winners such as a Bryson DeChambeau, obviously last year Cameron Davis is known for the elite distance he has off the tee, I could see this playing a little bit differently this year, because if you look at a lot of the consistent finishers, first off, Cam Davis missed his cut in the first 2 trips to this golf course, and then when Bryson DeChambeau has a made cut and a win at this golf course in his last 2 trips. Even Nate Lashley, who won the first ever iteration of this event, has missed the cut in both trips since. I think it's going to play different this time around yet again. This is a golf course that can change identities, and with the firm and fast conditions, the guys that have been consistent here have been the Kevin Kisners of the world. He's made the cut in every single trip here. Cameron Tringale has had a lot of success around this golf course. It's the accurate guys that can avoid that 4-inch bluegrass rough, which that is a huge factor, particularly if you're not a big beefy guy like Bryson. Hitting out of that 4-inch rough can be a tough task. It's the plotters that have had a lot of success here. And I think if we're going to get a firmer and a faster type of event here, we're going to have to lean even more into that. So, while over the years this has been a quote-unquote birdie fest, a quote-unquote putting fest, I've heard that word thrown around a lot this week. I'm not so sure it's going to play that same way, because the more and more I look at this, the more and more it just looks like, you hit a bunch of fairways, you get some extra rollout because of those firm and fast conditions, and then you hit wedges onto greens and you make your 5 to 10 footers, right? Because if it's going to play even shorter with those firm and fast conditions, those guys that are accurate off the tee also tend to be pretty good wedge players. I mean, think about it, right? Kevin Kisner hits a ton of fairways. Same thing with Cameron Tringale. Also tend to be top 10, top 20 wedge players on tour. I don't think that is a coincidence. So that should be the ideal skill set for this golf course, but I'm not going to ignore bombers, right? Obviously, you've seen winners at this event that have been bombers in the past, so I'm not going to ignore them just because it's slightly firmer and faster, but you still got to hit some fairways, right? Because if you're going to be hitting out of that Kentucky bluegrass rough with slightly crustier greens and fairways, it's going to be a tough task to stop the ball close. And, I'm still expecting a winner of at least like 13, 15 under par, even if it's going to play a little bit crustier this time around. You're going to have to make a fair amount of birdies out there, particularly on the par 5. So distance, maybe not as big of a factor this time around just because of that, which is probably going to be unique for me. I haven't seen a lot of people throwing that narrative around this year, but just based on the weather that I've seen, I don't see it playing as receptive. These are small greens. They're 5,000 square foot greens, right? So unless they're receptive, they're not going to be all that easy to hit, particularly because they're shaved off from the sides. But even more importantly than that, right, 37-yard wide fairways aren't that wide, particularly if they're going to play crusty. So I think it could be a unique situation this year. But with that in mind, knowing that the weather might be a little bit different this year around, let's go ahead and take a look at the golf course hole by hole, and I'll talk through some of the strategy here. Alrighty, I've got the golf course on the screen. As per usual, Pro Visualizer is the tool that we're using here. It lets you go hole by hole. You can set custom tee boxes, custom approach shots, everything like that. Get an idea for how you take apart this golf course, but more importantly for this video, how these professionals might take apart Detroit Golf Club. The first thing I want to note here is that the routing for the event is different than what we have here on Pro Visualizer. This is what you do, if you remember somebody who was a guest going out there and playing Detroit Golf Club before the event, I believe they're starting with hole number 8 and then going to hole number 9 as hole number 2. Don't quote me on that. I'll put it on the GCSAA site. It's down below in the comments. They will tell you exactly the routing that you're going with, but it's something along those lines. So just understand that hole number 1 might not be hole number 1 that you're seeing here on the tool here, but it will be these 18 holes. So let's go ahead and start this off. Look at hole number 1, which is a nearly 400-yard, 395-yard par 4. So this golf hole is not that hard. I mean, first off, you have the fairway bunkers I was talking about, which are conveniently placed, right? 275 yards to carry the bunker on the left here. And because you do have trees to the left and the right, one thing I'll mention as well is that the front 9 has a lot more trees on it than the back 9 does. A lot of players will be tempted to hit iron, but if you do, you will be bringing the bunkers into play. So guys like Bryson, Cam Davis, this was a hole a lot of them took driver on. So last year just took a lot of that out of play. but brought a lot of the trees into play on the side. So you can already see the risk reward factor that a lot of players are going to be faced with. Lay up off the tee, obviously bring a little bit more risk with the bunkers into play, but bring out the really big numbers out of play, like getting behind a tree and having the chip out sideways, making bogey at the very best. Out of a bunker, you could still make birdie, but you're also likely to get into another bad break, like a side hill lie, plugged lie, whatever it may be. There are a lot of decisions to be made around this golf course, but one thing's for sure, and you are going to see players that do this. If players take driver and are aggressive on this hole and they succeed in hitting the fairway, you can get it to within 60 to 70 yards. If you played this on like a PGA Tour 2K, you're going to have like 80, 60 yards and in on every single hole. You'll just hit the fairway, obviously with video game ability, and then be able to just hit a wedge to like 2 or 3 feet. That is possible for these tour players. They are more than capable of getting into a zone like that. And that's why you'll see something like 7-8 under par shot out there, like a 64, 65. Now it's a par 72, right? So shooting like 61, 62 might be a little bit out of reach, but that's why you're going to see so many birdies. Why guys like a Cameron Davis, who when he's clicking in all cylinders, he makes more birdies than anyone else out there. Bryson DeChambeau, when he's firing on all cylinders, will make birdies in bunches more than anybody else out there. Birdie or better percentage is a key indicator to success because this golf course, it gives you an opportunity to absolutely smash it. If you're hitting fairways off the tee and you're a bomber like both of those players are, you're going to have gimme birdie looks on every single hole. You're going to have like a 90-yard wedge shot, which even for a player like me of low ability, right, that's a single-digit handicap, it hits shots to 10 to 15 feet all day from 90 yards. That's my sweet spot. I love that shot. But imagine giving a tour player that opportunity on almost every single hole. That's what this golf course is. So let's go ahead and look through it. There's even more opportunities like that, like hole number 2, which is 454 yards. And while it's not super short, right, it's still 450 yards, this would be classified as a quote-unquote long hole around Detroit Golf Club because there's only 2 holes over 450 yards on the entire property. There's one over 475. There's one over 450 yards. That's it. The rest of them are going to be extremely gettable. So let's take a look at this one. Also, the fairway bunkers are conveniently placed, but most players will take driver and completely take them out of play. They're only in play for players that are taking it on with an iron off the tee. And you can see that there are also a few cross bunkers up here further in the fairway that could potentially come into play, but usually don't, right? You'd have to absolutely smash it. I believe, like 340, 350 yards to get to it. So even for the longest players like Bryson, they're probably going to leave it just short of that. And what is that? Leaving 115? Let's see, a little bit more conservative. Actually, let's go back to the previous shot here. Let's be a little bit more conservative off the tee. And let's get it out there 310, something like that, which is obtainable for every single player, particularly if conditions are going to be firm and fast. You're left with 140 yards. A 9-iron at the very most for these tour players. So for a long hole around this track, right, if you're dialed in off the tee, you're going to have next to nothing into one of the quote-unquote longer holes here. So I think you're starting to get an idea of just how gettable this place can be and why I'm looking at birdie or better percentage, the players that go out there and can chain together these opportunities. So next up, another right around 400-yard par 4, another hole where if you get it out there about 300 yards, you're left with a pitching wedge or even less in. So if you're one of these bombers, right, you might even try to sniff the green here, hit it something like 315, you're left with 75 yards, get it even a little bit more aggressive about it, you might have 40 or 50 yards in. So you can quickly see the opportunities here, and really, there's not much to worry about. Even on this hole right to the right, it's pretty much wide open, just a few trees that you'd really have to hit it offline to get to. On the left side here, you have a few sporadic trees, but even if you hit it near them, unless you're right against the trunk of the tree, you're going to have a shot to get onto this green. So driving accuracy quickly coming out of the equation if you're a bomber. Now, if you're somebody who's not very long off the tee, you better be hitting these fairways, right? Because if you're only 270, 280 yards off the tee, like a few of the shorter hitters might be here, let's see, like that's 280 yards right there. You might get behind some larger trees here or might get in the fairway bunker here, which this shot around a tree on the corner, not the easiest shot, or even out here to the right, you can see there's some trees in the play. That's because this course was designed in the early 1900s, guys. And this is, I think, the key factor this week. You either need to be long off the tee or you need to be extremely accurate. You need to be one or the two. You can't really be one of those tweener players that's kind of okay in either category. While that might be okay for shots gained off the tee, it's not going to be good this week because if you have short and you miss left and right, look what you're in. You're in absolute hell. That's the case on almost every single hole here on the front nine. So like I said, the front nine, a lot more trees than what you're going to have on the back nine. But if you're long off the tee, you can take it out of play, right? Completely. I mean, it just opens up like the freaking Red Sea over here to the right, just makes it extremely easy to hit over there. But if you're accurate, right, if you're somebody who's just going to take the measured approach, hit fairways all day, you're still only going to have 110 yards into the green. And those players, like I mentioned towards the beginning, like a Kevin Kisner, like a Cameron Tringale, for example, are also particularly skilled at hitting the wedge shots. So they're going to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. You have the super long par 5 here, 628 yards. And I don't see anyone reaching this. I mean, you're going to have a 300-yard 3-wood in. Maybe somebody takes a crack at it with driver off the deck or something like that. But for a majority of the field, will be a 3-shot hole where you're going to have 80 to 100 yards in for your third. So another birdie opportunity, kind of similar to the first 3 holes, to be frank with you. Hole number 5 is 150 yards. It's a par 3. It's a relatively small surface, so I guess that would be the one major difficulty here, but it's really not all that difficult once you get on it because it's so small, you're going to have like a 25 to 30 foot putt pretty much no matter what pin location they use. So much like every hole here, because of so much slope there is from the back to the front, just don't go long, right? Even if it's a back pin location, perhaps take your medicine, go 1 club shorter, just hit it there on the surface, 2 putt, and get out. Because like I said, the first 4 holes are just such great birdie opportunities. There's no reason to mess around on these par 3s, which they do have really small greens. That's the one thing I'll say about Detroit Golf Club, or the par 3s are still pretty difficult. And I guess it makes sense. That's the one part of the game, right? Par 3s, where off the tee play, this added distance that players have is kind of minimized because, off the tee with the driver, players hitting up on the golf ball, the drivers being made of metal rather than wood, all that adds to the distance off the tee. And sure, with an iron, right? There's been a lot of improvements with iron play. The distance gap with irons is a lot smaller than the distance gap that has been created over the years with the driver, right? So if there's any part of the golf course that should retain some of its teeth, and that has over the years, it is those par 3s, or they are the par 3s. Next up, we've got the par 4 6 tier, 468 yards. I believe with the tournament tees, it plays closer to 470 something yards. So again, that's the other quote unquote long hole in the golf course. There are some trees in place, so if there's any off the tee shot that is quote unquote demanding around this golf course, I suppose it would be the par 4 6, but a hole where if you hit the fairway, you should be able to get it on the relatively large surface, one of the larger greens that you have on property, and it's the hardest hole on the golf course, right? And if it's going to be a hard hole at 468, apologize. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. My computer, when I'm trying to record and do this, does some funky stuff. But with hole number 7, we have 557 yards. So it's a par 5. This one is going to be extremely gettable by pretty much the entire field. And not that much to worry about. Just hit the fairway here. You're going to have a look at the screen. Now, if you're offline, behind a tree, sure, you might have to lay up here to the layup zone, but it's a relatively easy layup. You can leave yourselves 80 to 100 yards with relative ease. We're about a 40 to 45 yard fairway here as well. So you're not going to be tested in any facet. So it's certainly a birdie hole. Could be an eagle hole for a lot of the field as well. Hole 8 is less than 400 yards, so just 373 yards. Going to be extremely gettable. You're going to see some players get it up towards the green. So Bryson, for example, was extremely aggressive here. He tried to take it as far down here as he could. 315 yards gets you pretty close to the surface. And in fact, I would not be surprised at all to see people get it on the green, particularly if there's not much wind. And while to get it to the middle of the green might be a little bit hard, right? 360 yards. To get it up there to chip range, 15 to 20 feet range, that is more than gettable, particularly for guys like a Cam Davis or Bryson DeChambeau. So, like I said, you got to be either really long off the tee here or really accurate, because if you're really long, you're going to take a lot of trouble out of play and also set up a few eagle looks. But also, if you're really accurate, you're just going to have wedge in hand all day from the center of the fairway, and you're going to be in the mayor's office more often than not. Like I said, there are more than one avenue to success around this venue. Hole number 9 is 209 yards. It is the hardest of the par 3s here, arguably one of the harder holes on the golf course, period. But it is a relatively large green. So Donald Ross, when he added quote unquote lengthy holes to the docket, which, this hole I'm sure was closer to 160, 170 yards back in the day, but still was probably on the longer end. He gave you a larger area to hit, a larger putting surface. So it's not the most difficult hole, but it's not the easiest, right? It's still a 200-yard approach shot. And now to the back nine. So on the front, we saw a lot of trees. Look in front of us. So this is the back nine over here. Do you see many trees? Sure, there's a few, right? Obviously over to the left with the residential area. But out there, do you see many trees? I don't, right? It's relatively wide open. So when people talk about this golf course being wide open, they really mean the back nine, because the front nine, as we saw, there are trees to be had. Maybe the bombers don't necessarily have to worry about it. On the back nine, truly everyone could almost just go bombs away in every single hole. So hole number 10, 427 yards. Another short par 4 where you don't even have to hit driver, but if you want to, you can bomb it over the corner. It wouldn't surprise me to see players try and take it down here as much as 310, 320, because look how large the landing area is, right? If you take it over the trees, you're going to have plenty of room to land your drive. So, the more aggressive you are here, the easier this hole end up playing. But even for some of the shorter hitters that just, again, decide to take an iron, hit it to the edge of the dog leg, are going to have a wedge at most in. Hole number 11 is a 220-yard par 3, so it is on the longer end. Obviously a hole that was lengthened over the years. They were not doing 220-yard par 3s back in the early 1900s. I can promise you that much. So it is a small green. So I expected this hole probably played like 140, 130 yards because it is a thimble out there. So of the par 3s, it's relatively difficult, just like hole number 9, but it's going to be doable. Especially last year with the receptive conditions, it wasn't all that hard at all. Now this year, if it's going to be crusty out there, if it's going to be even the slightest bit firm, that might play a good bit over par, but that might be the only hole on property, that hole number 9, that even have a chance of sniffing over par. I'd expect almost every single hole otherwise to play under par. Hole number 12 is 462 yards. Again, a quote-unquote long par 4, right? But, depending on where they put the tee location, it could play as short as 420 yards. So let's go back to the tee shot so I can give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I'm going to skip too far there. All right, there we go. Perfect. A lot of times they're playing from these tee boxes. Now, they can play it from back here at 462. I just know from experience the first few events that they didn't do that all that often. And even if they play it from back there, this tee shot, you can take this bunker out of play, right? It's only 290 to carry the damn thing. Most players have at least 295 yards in the bag. If not, guys like Bryson that are going to get it out there 330, 325 yards at the very least. And yet again, especially for the longer players on tour, you're going to have a 9-iron and 8-iron at the very most into a relatively large surface. Hole 13 is 395, so similar to hole number 1, I believe hole number 3, that was 394 yards. Another wedge opportunity. Wide open off the tee. There's a few trees and shrubs there, but nothing super severe. You can see the trees that are here on the back 9 are sporadic, right? It's 2 to 3 trees together. It's 2 to 3 trees over here to the right. Because it's not a super dense forest, even if you end up over in this junk over here, which if you're taking driver off the tee, you might end up in it, you're going to have a shot into the green, whether it's elevating over them if you have enough room to get that clearance, or just go under them and run up a ball onto the green. Again, all the greens are sloped from back to front, which means if you're doing one of those bump and runs up the front surface, you're going to get help from the undulation and stopping the golf ball. So you will see that as an opportunity, or at least as an option for some of the players around this venue. Hole 14 is 565 yards, so an extremely gettable par 5, and this is the only hole on property with water in play. So you do have a decision to be made off the tee. If you can get it out there in the fairway, you're going to have 250 yards into the green, which isn't all that bad over water. Maybe if you miss the fairway or you're a shorter hitter, you might end up laying up just in front of the lake. But in either circumstance, going to be a hole that you see plenty of birdies on and perhaps even a few eagles. Hole 15 is 159 yards, so kind of similar to the other short par 3. This is a birdie opportunity to be had by pretty much the entire field. It's a large surface. It does have the shaved off areas on the side, so if you do miss the target here, you are going to see that miss exaggerated a little bit by the contours. But certainly a hole that a lot of the field will make birdie on, or at least have a look at birdie on. Hole 16 is 450, relatively short, a hole where you bomb it out there. You're probably going to have a 9-iron at most, more than likely a wedge in. And the bunkering a little bit better here, because you can see, these farther bunkers, they're at like 320 yards. And that's what I mean by a lot of the strategic bunkering. A lot of it has been at like 290, so if you have a miss hit, you're probably ending up in it. But these ones at 320, even a solid drive here by some of the longer players could end up in it. So, I hope that they're able to add more bunkering to this golf course over the years, because if every hole had the bunkering at 320, this would play completely differently, right? This is like the only hole where, those longer hitters like a Cam Davis or Bryson, for example, have to really worry about it because, on every other hole, they can almost take the bunkering out of play by hitting driver, right? It's almost counterintuitive. Being more aggressive is advantageous for them. It makes their game a little bit more consistent, whereas the shorter hitters, if they're taking driver, they're going to be right in that sweet spot. So this might be the one hole that, they tried to combat against the driving game, but hopefully maybe they're watching this and they can figure this out over the years. These type of bunkers are what they need here to make the winning score a little bit lower, at least maybe change up the strategy for a few players off the tee. But either way, I digress. It's a birdie hole, especially if you're able to hit the fairway here, like pretty much every hole here. Hole 17 is the last par 5. It's 575 yards, and it's gettable in 2. It's just like all the other par 5s, maybe except for the one that's 630 yards. But most players will go for it in 2. If you miss the fairway, you'll lay up to a relatively generous landing area, and then have another birdie look. And lastly, we have hole number 18, which they're going to play it mostly from these front tees. I can just tell you from experience, most of the pin locations, or say tee locations, were up here before, so closer to like 420 yards. I guess they wanted to let you be a little bit more aggressive off the tee. So you can see a lot of more players were getting it down there towards this little gully down there. Now, it's not a water hazard. It's technically a hazard here, but you can play balls out of that gutch there. So a lot of players will be aggressive off the tee here. It's a massive landing area. And hole number 18, while at most golf courses can be a little bit of a brute, here at the Rocket Mortgage Classic, it's pretty much just like all the other holes. You hit the fairway, you hit the green with the wedge, and you walk out of there with the birdie. All right, now that we've seen the course hole by hole, let's go ahead and talk about some of my key stats for analysis. So first off, we've got birdie or better percentage at number 1. This golf course is extremely gettable. And like I mentioned before, if you get into that flow state where you're hitting fairways at 320 yards plus, you're hitting those 70 to 80 yard wedges to 4 to 5 feet, you can easily make 9 or even 10 birdies on this golf course. That is more than obtainable. And while there are a few holes where, if you're a little bit hairy off the tee, you can get into a little bit of trouble, it's nothing like the 3M Open, right? The 3M Open, we also looked at birdie or better percentage, and that was a lot to try to make up for mistakes. Here at the Rocket Mortgage Classic, it's just to try and beat everyone else because this golf course is easy regardless of your skill set. How you go out there and put yourself into contention is by posting 6 to 7 under par rounds and 2 or 3 of your rounds of the 4. So players that are aggressive, that are willing to take those chances off the tee, set up those 80 to 90 yard wedge shots are the type of players I'm looking at. So birdie or better percentage, a stat you can look at. You can look at opportunities gained. That's a stat that's on plenty of databases out there that I'd also be using to identify these aggressive type players. In either circumstance, I'm looking for players with a little bit of firepower. And over the last 2 years, this golf course specifically has been an absolute goldmine for me. I hit a Bryson DeChambeau outright when he won back here in 2020. I also had him locked in all of my DFS lineups, so ended up going great from that perspective. But on top of that, last year, Cam Davis was somebody I talked up here on this channel as not only a value pick, in fact, my number 1 value pick of the week, but also somebody I bet outright. So, and I mentioned that during that value pick video, was very adamant about his chances to potentially even win this golf tournament. Both of those players, Bryson and Cam Davis, were number 1 in the field, at least per price. So first off, Bryson was just off the charts at that point. He was due for a win that week, so that's why I locked him. But Cam Davis at $7,200 last year was off the charts in terms of birdie or better percentage, right? In that 7K range, was head and shoulders the best player going out there and generating birdie looks. So for me, that's what I've been hunkering down on, and it's worked emphatically extremely well over the last few years. It's going to be my number 1 key stat this year as well. And it checks, both the eye test perspective, just knowing how many birdie looks are to be had out there, but also the past results perspective, both with Bryson winning, Cam Davis winning, also a lot of the top finishers like a Matthew Wolff. Even last year, a lot of the guys that cracked the top 5 were also top 5 to top 10 in the field in birdie or better rate. Next up, we've got shots gained putting, which I hate making a key stat because putting can be extremely volatile. It's the most likely stat to flip overnight. I mean, somebody like Cam Champ last year was one of the worst putters on tour, and then out of nowhere at the 3M Open was number 1 in the field in shots gained putting. That is possible with putting week to week, right? With shots gained approach, shots gained off the tee, you aren't going to see nearly as much variance. In fact, when we see outlier performances from shots gained tee to green, we get surprised. With putting, it doesn't surprise us, right? Cameron Champ going out there and gaining 8 strokes to the field last year at the 3M really was just whatever. That happens, right? We expect that with the flat stick. So I hate making it a key stat for that reason. But but we have to this week. With all the greens, with all the wedges that are going to be in hand, it is going to be about converting more 10 to 15 footers than the rest of the field. Now, those 5 footers, those 7 footers, sure, you're going to have to make those, but you're not going to be separating yourself from the field making them, right? You're going to be expected to make those 7 to 10 foot putts. Now, that 10 to 15 foot range, that 15 to 20 foot range, that's going to be where you make your money here. So shots gained putting, going to be a key stat I'm looking at, but most particularly shots gained putting on the bent POA hybrid. Last year, the key stat that gave me a huge indication of Cam Davis's potential here were his bent POA splits. On bent POA, he was a whole 0.7 shots better than any other surface over his last year. And I'm pulling that from my stats last year because that was really the number one reason I played him, was that and his birdie or better percentage. So not a surprise that shots gained putting's here at number 2. But outside of that, in all 3 iterations of this event, the top 10 scores on the leaderboard have gained strokes putting. Every single one of them. And while, for a single year sample size, that might be something that we can push aside as an outlier. It's been 3 years at this point, and that is a trend that has not been broken. So I would expect that to continue this year around. And it makes sense from the shots perspective, right? The fact that they're going to see a 15 to probably 20 under par winner, maybe slightly harder if it's firm and fast this year. Definitely something that I'm looking at for my analysis. And lastly, we have shots gained approach. So approach play, it's always going to be important. In fact, it's usually number 1 on this list. Maybe a little bit less important this week, but definitely something that I'm looking at. Most importantly, a few proximity ranges that I think you might want to hunker down on. So first and foremost, the 250 yard plus range, with the 4 par 5s being some of the more scoreable holes on this venue. The guys that can get home in 2 are certainly worth a few looks, because to get to 15 to 20 under par, you know you're going to have to make birdies in bunches. And with 16 opportunities on par 5s throughout the week, if you're able to hit those long iron shots or a lot of woods, from that 250 plus yard range, going to be extremely helpful. That's number 1. A few other proximity buckets, 75 to 100, and also the 100 to 125 yard range. Both of those are quote unquote wedge ranges, and around this venue are going to be extremely overutilized. So if you look at Data Golf, you go to their course profile or tournament profile for this week's event, you'll get to see the actual percentages, but 250 yard plus, 75 to 100, and the 100 to 125 yard range are the most overutilized. And it makes sense. We went hole by hole. I showed you just how many wedge opportunities you can set up around this venue. And then, of course, I showed you the par 5s, which might not all be super long. There's the one that's 600 yards. You can still go for them in 2 with a 3-wood or a 5-wood. So it's going to be an important factor this week. So I'm taking a look at those proximity buckets. But more than anything, shots gained approach, the most consistent stat for week to week. So it should not be a surprise to see that in the modeling and for it to be one of the key parts of my model week to week. Lastly, a few other key stats I'm considering. So we've got shots gained off the tee. Like I mentioned during the video, be elite at one thing or the other. Be somebody who can set up fairway looks all day. Just stripe the ball, 90% plus fairway rate at a golf course with massive fairways. That is one avenue for success, right? Because you're going to have mid to low irons in for every single wedge, or even wedges in for every single green, or be an elite distance guy, right? I showed you what guys like a Cam Davis or a Bryson were able to accomplish, taking a lot of the trees out of play. But more importantly, when you have that driving accuracy down and you couple it with that distance, you could have 50 to 60 yard wedge shots all day. I mean, just gimme birdie looks for at least 10 to maybe even 15 holes around this venue. So shots gained off the tee, it's not going to be one of the quote unquote main 3 key stats that I'm looking at for this week. But if somebody is elite in one of the 2 categories, they will certainly be getting a sizable boost. Something I want to go over here as well is par 5 scoring. Par 5 scoring with those 4 par 5s will be important. Shots gained at Birdie Fest, also something I'm looking at. So when players are put in similar conditions where you're going to see 5 to 6 birdies made for plenty of players, who thrives in those sort of conditions? Taking a look at shots gained at my comp courses, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Shots gained around the green will have a relatively low weighting this week, but it is in the modeling, right? We can't completely ignore around the green play. And also shots gained at Detroit Golf Club, while it is in my modeling, course history here, probably not something we can hunker down on too much. Even in a 3-round sample size, it hasn't proven to be all that important, or at least all that correlated to success. I mean, like I said, Nate Lashley missed the cut multiple times after winning. Even somebody like Bryson missed the cut last year. Cam Davis missed the cut multiple times before winning last year. We also only have 3 years of data, right? So we don't even have that much to go off of, right? So it's not like we can be making a ton of assertions there to begin with. We'll wrap things up here with my comp courses. So at number 1, we have TPC River Highlands, which is a golf course that has the same exact hybrid surface as what we're going to see this week. So a 75-25 split between bent grass and Poa Anua is the same thing we saw at the Travelers, and also a relatively gettable setup. And while it's surprising that it's relatively gettable because it has small greens and also not the biggest fairways, also 4-inch rough, all of those things are the exact same situation this week. Like I mentioned, relatively small greens, but a 75% GIR rate, fairway percentage well above the tour average, despite fairways only being about 2.5 yards wide. And while that might have been caused due to the receptiveness of the greens, I mean, that's what we've seen at the Travelers over the years. So if you're a buyer on it, it's going to be a regular year of the Detroit Golf Club, right? You're not expecting it to be super firm and fast. That golf tournament is a great comp, right? Last year, this golf course and what we saw at the Travelers played almost identically. Now, around that venue, a lot more water in play. Also, from the visual perspective, I'd argue that the tee shots around that golf course are a lot more demanding, but nonetheless, at least in terms of scoring conditions, especially when it comes to the shots gained profile that has succeeded at both golf courses, there is a lot of overlap and definitely a lot of comparisons I think you can make. Next up, we've got Country Club of Jackson, which is home of the Sanderson Farms Golf Tournament during the fall swing. And though we are extremely removed from that event, so it's not like we're pulling on recent form when taking a look at the Sanderson Farms, from a shot-making perspective, it's extremely similar. So first and foremost, off the tee play, it's relatively wide open, right? Unless you're missing 30 to 40 yards wide, you're probably not going to be in all that much trouble. Also, relatively receptive, easy to hit greens. At the Country Club of Jackson, it's not much undulation. It's not usually that difficult of a track. I mean, you're usually going to see a winning score well into 15, maybe even close to 20 under par. That's how I'm expecting this to play. And while Country Club of Jackson, you're not going to see like a 25 to 30 under par winner, I don't think you're going to see that at the Rocket Mortgage Classic, especially this year, a slightly firmer and faster greens. So, it's a quote unquote birdie fest, but, it's a birdie fest not on steroids, right? You're not going to see a 25 under par winner, close to 30 under par, like we saw at the Century Tournament of Champions, but you're still going to see plenty of birdies made. So I like it from the shot making perspective, but also from the winning score perspective where, maybe it's close to the middle teens in terms of winning score, right? Close to like 15 to 16 under par. That's what I'm projecting it for this year, at least with the weather conditions that we have as of right now. And that's what we usually see at the Country Club of Jackson. And at number 3, we have TPC Deer Run. So the home of the John Deere Classic, another quote-unquote birdie fest where you're going to see plenty of guys hit greens, hit fairways. It's a lot more about cashing in on opportunities than it is setting up opportunities. And while I think it's maybe a little bit more of a putting fest there at the John Deere Classic than what you're going to see this week with relatively small greens, again, they're just 5,000 square foot on average, there's a lot of overlap, particularly because it's in that realm of quote-unquote recent form where, the shots gained metrics that we're pulling from are at least recent enough to where they have some significance to us. I kind of like the fact that the Country Club of Jackson there with the Sanderson Farms is so far back because it gives us an ability to pull from results and some of the shots gained metrics from a while ago, right? Rather than everything being super recent. So, I kind of like the Travelers because it's recent. Same thing with TPC Deer Run, but I also like the diversity that we're getting with adding something like we had with the Sanderson Farm. So those are the top 3 comps that I'm going with. A few extras that I was considering. We have TPC Craig Ranch is in my modeling. We have TPC Twin Cities from last week. Despite it having all the water, it's also a quote-unquote birdie fest where you're going to see plenty of birdies made and that we saw made last week. Silverado Resort and Spa for the Fortinet I'm taking a look at, and also Albany Country Club, which is the home of the Hero World Challenge. While we don't have shots gained metrics there, it's another golf course where it's a birdie fest. You're going to go out there, almost a resort style setup, and make birdies in bunches. Guys, that is all I've got for the course breakdown this week. Before you hop on out of here, make sure to smash that like button. Also, go ahead and comment down below what you think the winning score is going to be. Officially, at least for this part, I'm going to go ahead and say 16 under par. Now, weather could throw that completely in one direction or the other, but at least with the information I have right now, that's what I'm going with. But go ahead and give me your thoughts down below. And as per usual, we'll have you covered for all of the fantasy content, showdown, prize picks videos that I'm putting out here day to day on the channel. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of that when it drops. But I'm looking forward to it. It's a much stronger field this week than what we had for last week at the 3M Open. So I'm expecting there to be a little bit more excitement for this event, perhaps better betting lines out there. I know the consistency is going to be a whole lot better this week than last because of that water out there, all of that wind, all of that chaos, carnage that was caused by those conditions are thrown out, right? There's one water hazard here. Wind is supposed to be relatively low for this golf course. Fingers crossed at least, right? Hoping those weather conditions can stay pat. I'm expecting this to be a relatively solid week of ROI. Last week was a little bit rough for us on the DraftKings side because of all that carnage, all that chaos out there. I think a lot of people kind of struggled last week. I don't think we were alone in that book. But I'm looking forward to this week. I'm expecting a huge bounce back in that department. That's for sure. So looking forward to it, guys. Hopefully everybody has a solid week with their slips, all their betting lineups, fantasy lineups, all that sort of fun stuff as well. And let's get this cash.